audience, instead of a lecture, let's make it a, interrupt as I'm going along. So it's a tutorial rather than a lecture, as we academics say. So that's the title there on the slide there. So I'm an economist, and so a lot of this is economics. Are you guys doing economics, or are you?
No, not doing economics.
And I think you.
Well, I'm an economic historian.
You're an economic historian, so I expect you know some economics, probably more than I know history, I expect. I'm going to keep the jargon to a minimum, but there is economics in it, and I think that's the best way to proceed. So I may put up a diagram with a couple of equations on there from time to time. Apologies about that, and you can always ignore the equations. They don't really matter, and we can easily explain them verbally if necessary. Now let me just find the presentation first of all. It seems to have disappeared. Where is it? It's there, isn't it? Okay, we're such a small but elite audience, we're going to turn this into a kind of interactive thing. So do interrupt if you want to ask questions or make comments or complaints or anything you like, really. Okay, so that's the title of the paper then. Worker savings and the right to manage, how worker cooperatives could take over the world. Now, in fact, I put that title up as a catchy title. In fact, we're going to see that according to my calculations, worker cooperatives could take over about maybe 30% of the world, and we'll come to the exact numbers at the end. The paper's based on two academic papers, that one by me in the Journal of Economic Surveys, and this one by Philip Wyman in the Cambridge Journal of Economics about Swedish wage earner investment funds. So if you want to see the originals, that's where you can go back to. Okay, as I said, I'm an economist, and so I'm obviously interested in economics education. And if you look at the syllabus in economics in Edinburgh and most British universities, you find almost no references to cooperatives at all. And that's a little bit strange. If we go back to a guru of economics in the past, John Stuart Mill, The Principles of Political Economy, which was published in, I think, 1848 or thereabouts, we'll see this quote, which I've got on the slide there. The form of association, which, if mankind continue to improve, must be expected to predominate, is not that which can exist with capitalist as chief and work people without a voice in the management, but the association of labourers, of the labourers themselves, on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations and working under managers elected and removed by themselves. So that's from John Stuart Mill, The Principles of Political Economy. That was the standard textbook in economics at a place called Oxford University until 1919. But from 1919 onwards, things rather went downhill, and the references to cooperatives in economics textbooks diminished and diminished and diminished. And in fact, Roderick Hill published this article in the Journal of Economic Education in 2000, where he scoured through some of the leading textbooks in economics looking for references to cooperatives. And he found about a couple of footnotes, a couple of minor mentions, and he went through maybe a dozen or so economics textbook standard ones. So there's not much in the economics curricula, in British universities at least, about cooperatives, and that I think is a pity. But if we look at John Stuart Mill's original quotation up there on the slide there, it's the form of economic organisation which he says must be expected to predominate. And that, unfortunately, has not turned out to be true. We know that there are lots of cooperatives around the world, thousands and thousands of them in Italy and Scandinavia, for example, and even some in America and the UK, but they only account for somewhere between 3 and 6% of the GDP in those countries. The other thing to notice from the quote there is the reference to collectively owned capital. And I want to come back to that. That's possibly one of the problems. The arrangements for the financing and ownership of capital provide us with one of the best ways, I think, to explain this paucity of workers' cooperatives. So we'll come back to that point. That's going to be the main thrust of the talk. Okay, so the talk's called Worker Savings and the Right to Manage. What do I mean by the right to manage? Well, the right to manage means, what's up on the slide there, it's the right to decide on how to use capital. So it's the right to decide what and how much to produce, how to price the product, what techniques of production to use, what research and development to carry out, what new investments to make and what old ones to get rid of, how to allocate workers to different tasks, to allocate internal rewards such as promotion, and to hire and fire workers. And under capitalism, the whole point, I mean, we normally define capitalism in terms of ownership. Is it private or public ownership? But much more fundamentally than that, to my mind at least, is where is the right to manage allocated? Under capitalism, the right to manage capital is linked to the ownership of capital. And so, for example, what we used to call the socialist economies of Russia and Eastern Europe, for example, we ought more probably to call them state capitalism. Those societies were not societies without property, they were societies with state property. The state owned capital and had the right to manage it, or to appoint agents to manage on its behalf. So, so-called socialist economies of Russia and Eastern Europe prior to transition, we might refer to those as state capitalist economies. So, on this definition then, private capitalism is not the same thing as a market economy. Those people who like to defend capitalism often really put up arguments which are defences of the market. But actually, they're the apologists for capitalism. The capitalists themselves don't really like markets very much. They like to get rid of them. For one thing, they don't like competition. And if you're going to have a market, let's make it a monopoly if it's all possible. So, capitalism is not necessarily a market system. It's really a system of private ownership which allocates the right to manage to owners and not to anybody else, and in particular, not to the guys that actually work with the capital, the workers themselves within the firm. Hi. Given this elite but small audience, we're going to turn this into a sort of interactive, kind of more like a tutorial, so do feel free to interrupt and ask questions, make comments or criticisms if you want to do that. Okay, so that's the right to manage then. And conversely, just as really we shouldn't think of capitalism as an essentially market system, we can also think of the problem the other way around and argue that non-capitalist organisations could work perfectly efficiently within a market framework. So there's a kind of case for a sort of market socialism, if you like. And that's the kind of thing that I want to talk about in the paper here. Do feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you wish to do so. Okay, so that's the right to manage then. So, as I say, I want to define capitalism as a system which allocates that right to manage to the owners of capital and not to the people who work with it, namely the workers within the firm. So we can contrast that with the idea of a self-managed firm. And a self-managed firm is a one where the right to manage rests with workers and not with owners. And we should therefore distinguish between workers in their capacities as suppliers of labour and workers in their capacity as owners of the firm. So a self-managed firm is not the same thing as a worker-owned firm. Okay? They are different things. And so it's possible to conceive of a firm where the owners are the workers themselves, but their status as owner has to be separated quite clearly from their status as supplier of labour. So that's what I want to do as I go through the talk today. So that's the first characteristic then, that in a self-managed firm, which we might think of as a cooperative, the right to manage, the right to take all those decisions we had on the previous slide, rests with the workers themselves in their capacity as suppliers of labour and not as owners of the firm. Second point then, that management should be exercised in a democratic way of some kind and not a hierarchical one. So we know that actually most organisations, including universities, you might say particularly universities, have a hierarchical structure, kind of boss at the top, layers of middle management and so on, and the guys at the bottom actually doing the work. So in a cooperative or a self-managed firm then, part of the definition is that management should be democratic and not hierarchical. And there's a striking contrast there, because I'm going to talk about cooperatives or self-managed firms within the context of political democracies. So in an economy like this, for example, where we elect the First Minister, that's the Prime Minister of Scotland, and the Prime Minister, the First Minister, we elect our politicians and our government, and we're free to criticise them without penalty, more or less, That doesn't apply within the firm. You don't elect the boss. Well, I certainly didn't elect the principal of Edinburgh University, and try criticising them, that can be a very dangerous business. So in a democratic capitalist society, there is this contrast between political democracy on the one hand, and, if you like, economic totalitarianism on the other within the firm.
Out of interest, the principles you talked about earlier with John Stuart Mill, did he outline anything to do about democratic?
He did, yes. If you look at the Principles of Political Economy, he did talk about that. In fact, if we go back to that original quote, if I can get this gadget to work. Association of labourers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital, and working under managements elected and removable by themselves. So he thought very much of a cooperative as a democratic firm, where you can, now you may vest authority temporarily. I mean, we may decide to form a cooperative out of the people in this room and say, well, for a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, you can be the boss. We'll vest you with temporary authority to allocate us to particular tasks, for example. That might be an efficient way to organise the firm, but you've got to stand for election in 2 or 3 years, so you have to take into account, our wishes when you take your decisions. So John Stuart Mill definitely did have a view of democracy within the firm, as you can see from the quote. Right, okay, so democratic management then. Third part of the definition on the slide there, the reward to workers should be based on the firm's performance. So it should be some form of profit sharing or revenue sharing, or perhaps sharing income per worker. So income per worker is, if you like, the revenue minus the non-labour costs divided by the number of workers. So something like that, profit sharing, revenue sharing, something along those lines, and not by a fixed wage. Right, okay, so that's our definition of a self-managed firm. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that cooperatives, which are the closest approximation we can find in capitalist economies to self-managed firms. There is another case in point, actually, and that's Yugoslav self-management. Some of you know about that, and I can say a little bit about that if you want to, but I want to focus this talk really on cooperatives. After all, it's students for cooperation, is it not? So I want to do that rather than talk about Yugoslavia. But Yugoslav firms are something like what, before the reform set in under Yugoslav self-management, those firms approximated in some respects to self-management, so they provide us with some evidence. But focusing on cooperatives in Western economies, they appear to, there's a lot of empirical evidence on this, and they appear to have all kinds of advantages. They appear to give a better quality of working life, to be more productive in some sense, and to smooth out employment over the trade cycle. We know that capitalist economies are subject to cyclical variations over time, and there's an argument and some evidence to support it to the effect that cooperatives operate counter-cyclically, that they tend to smooth employment out over the trade cycle, which is a good thing. That will have the effect of dampening the trade cycle, at least it would if the cooperative sector were large enough in the economy. So there's some arguments and some evidence to suggest that cooperatives have got all kinds of advantages. Productivity, quality of working life, and some macroeconomic advantages too. So that raises the obvious question, if they're so great, why aren't there more of them? And as I said, in fact there are several thousand cooperatives in Italy and Scandinavia and places like that, but they only account for a relatively small proportion, between 3 and 6% of the GDP of those countries. So that leads us to the famous Pangloss theorem. Now, as this is a very cultured group of students, Edinburgh University students are always up, I'm sure Northumbria ones too. You all have read your French literature, right? So you've all read Candide. Anyone doing literature? No, of course not, they're pagans. Anyway, right, so French literature, Candide by Voltaire, has this character called Dr. Pangloss, or Professor Pangloss, and he was an optimist. And he, whatever disasters were described to him, the famous Portuguese earthquake, for example, where thousands of people were killed, he would always say, well, it might look like a terrible disaster, but don't worry, everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. So what he meant by that was anything which looks bad, if you think about it long enough, you can find a reason to think it's actually quite good. So the earthquake, which appears to have brought misery and suffering to many, Dr. Pangloss would have said, well, Not really, because it makes those of us who are left appreciate our lives more. Right? So it may have killed thousands of people, but it's made the ones remaining better off because they have a better attitude to life in some sense. So you get a lot of this in economics. You get a lot of this Pangloss stuff in economics. And I've decided that it's quite useful as we economists like to use mathematical terminology. I myself did my first degree in mathematics, so I like theorems. And so I decided we should state this as a theorem. What is optimal, with a corollary that no reform is necessary or desirable. So to put that in sort of ordinary language, why don't we see more cooperatives? Well, there's nothing to stop people forming cooperatives. After all, this is a free society. If we wanted to form a cooperative, if we really thought it was going to be better than employment in an ordinary capitalist firm, for example, nothing to stop us forming a cooperative, right? So the fact that we don't see many cooperatives, or rather they don't produce a very high proportion of GDP, that's just proof that they're not that great after all. After all, it may be that a few cooperatives have better productivity, and they're the ones that we'll observe. So when we do our empirical work, we'll observe the kind of more successful cooperatives that have, as it were, come to the fore in the struggle for survival of the fittest, as it were. So there's this argument that, and this doesn't just apply to cooperatives, by the way, it applies to all kinds of things, institutions that we observe. What we're observing must be the best possible institutional setup, because if there were a better alternative, it would have arisen by virtue of competition and as it were, natural economic selection. Well, there's lots of arguments against the Pangloss approach, and I don't want to go into them now, but you can hear, I think, one of them implicit in what I've just said, and that is that it's basically, or it can be at least, based on a kind of evolutionary argument, which is borrowed from biology, survival of the fittest. And you might say, well, there's lots of things wrong with that. I mean, in biological evolution, the outside environment is taken to be fixed. You know, the agents, the animals or creatures evolving don't actually directly influence that environment. Whereas in economics, of course, those agents create that environment. So there isn't that independence between the environment and the things being evolved. So there's all kinds of reasons not to believe in the Pangloss theorem, but we still need to ask ourselves why there are relatively few cooperatives around. And that leads us to some economic theory. And there is some economic now. None of you are doing economics, as I asked before, so you're going to have to bear with me a little bit here. There's a little bit of jargon coming up. We have got a fairly well worked out theory of the self-managed economy and the self-managed firm. And that theory leads us to an explanation for why there are relatively few cooperatives around. And it's based on the idea of financing the firm's capital structure. And the argument basically says that the trouble with cooperatives, and the reason there aren't more of them in the economy, in the market economy, is because they try to finance themselves internally from retained earnings. And that's a problem. Now, it's a little difficult to explain exactly why that's a problem, but it's linked to collective ownership. Essentially, cooperatives do have a form of collective ownership. Ownership of the firm is not individualized, and it's partly because of this problem of financing capital accumulation internally from retained earnings. The theory suggests, and by the way, there's a lot of evidence for this, there are two main effects at work here. The first one's called the Furubotn-Pejovic effect. It's a horizon effect arising from this collective ownership problem, and it leads to underinvestment in a cooperative. The problem there is that if we take a collective decision to invest in something, let's say we form a cooperative here, we decide we're going to invest in a new piece of capital equipment, that piece of capital equipment is almost certainly going to last longer than we are in the firm. So we're going to leave the firm possibly, or die, or retire, or something like that, before that investment project comes to the end of its life. So when we take into account the rate of return on that investment project, we'll realise at that stage that we won't be able to recoup our part of the investment. We don't have individual title to that. It's owned by the cooperative collective. Right? So we won't be able to recoup our bit of the capital if we leave the firm, right, for whatever reason. And in fact, we'll actually have to forego some of the rate of return as well, because some of it will accrue after we've left the firm. Right? So, because of that, we demand a higher rate of return on that project than would be the case in an ordinary capitalist firm, which is just trying to maximise its profits. In an ordinary capitalist firm, let's say it's owned by shareholders, they can always recoup they have an individual stake, their share. They could sell that on a secondary market, they could take it away with them, they could do whatever they like. In a cooperative, you can't do that. So because of that horizon effect, as we call it, the horizon of the investment projects is longer than our expected membership of the cooperative, we're going to demand a higher rate of return on that investment project before we carry it out, right? And that means we're going to carry out less, everything else being equal, we're going to carry out less investment. So projects which would have been taken on by the capitalist firm with its outside owners, we don't take on, right? So we end up with the capital labour ratio, the ratio of capital to labour in the firm, too low. Okay, so the second one we call the Vanek effect. So these are the names. By the way, if you look at this literature, the literature I'm quoting here, it's got a kind of cowboys and Indians character about it. There's a kind of Cornell school of thought on this. That's represented by Vanek, the guy I'm coming to just now. And there's a Texas school. And they're the guys with the big black hats on. It won't take you long to work out who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. The Texas guys, they tend to be kind of East Europeans who become Americans. And they, as represented, for example, by Furubert and Pejovich, they tend to, I mean, both sides of this argument put the stress on property rights, finance, these issues. But on the one hand, the Texas guys say, well, basically, self-management cooperatives are never going to work. No kidding, you can't find many of them in a market economy. They do believe in the Pangloss theorem, right? They say, that's just proof that these things can't work. The Cornell guys, as represented, for example, by Vanek, would say, yeah, there obviously are problems, but they're not insurmountable. What we should do is to look at what the theory says, reject the Pangloss theorem completely, and say, right, this tells us how to deal with the problem, how to design institutions to solve it, right? And that, one of those solutions, or the main solution, is the one I want to present to you today. Okay, so the Vanek effect then, that's the second effect. So, although these two things may seem to be in the very much the same vein, and in terms of economic theory they are, but in terms of policy implications they're very different, right? Because the Vanek and the other Cornell people want to improve institutions to help cooperatives work efficiently, whereas the Texas guys want to say, don't do anything, we're Panglossians, if you try and intervene in the market, you just make everything worse. So the Vanek effect then is to do with the opportunity cost of capital, and it says with collective ownership, the trouble is that members of the cooperative will treat the opportunity cost of capital as zero. So what they could do with their capital, the alternatives, they just ignore that. And that's because they don't individually own the capital, it's collectively owned. Now it's a little bit difficult to explain this without some economics, unfortunately, but what you can show is that if that's the case, that'll lead the cooperative to being too small. Because what it'll do, I'll try and give an intuitive explanation. I've got a diagram in a moment just to show you the result. But the idea is that if the cooperative is, or each individual member of the cooperative is treating the opportunity cost of capital as zero, it doesn't have to pay any of that cost in effect, then it'll try to get smaller. For example, it'll never want to take on any more members, right? Because what it's trying to do is increase, make it as large as possible, maximize the income per worker, the remuneration of each worker. So what it'd like to do is, as people leave, it never wants to take any more on, right? Because it's got this block of capital which is costing nothing, and as people leave and are not replaced, each remaining person is working with more and more capital and getting richer and richer. So you end up with one person left sitting on an enormous amount of free capital and making a huge amount of income, and loads of unemployed people outside the firm, the outsiders. On a macro level, that should, well, actually you're too young, mercifully, to remember this, but At a macro level, I don't know, our colleague from Northumbria might remember this under the dreaded Thatcher period. Mrs. Thatcher used to go around talking about how productive the British economy was under her kind of sadomonetarist policies. And the thing about that was that that's because loads of people were unemployed, right? If you just have loads of people unemployed, the ones that are still left will be working with huge amounts of capital each. That's as you found some firm in South Wales somewhere which had the highest productivity of its type in the world or something. And that's because the rate of unemployment in that particular area was massive, like 30% or something ridiculous. So if you just sack a load of people, the ones that are left will be working with a lot of capital each. They'll have a high income. They'll appear to be they are very productive. But why do you want productivity? What you want is product, right? So there's no point in having productivity if it's at the expense of massive unemployment. So this is a kind of micro version of that, if you like. Okay, so if we take these two effects together, then we can look at a diagram to... Now, sorry about this, but this is how we do things in economics. Now, right, so none of you are doing economics, but so let me not labour this too much. I'm going to come around the front so I can see it. My notes here don't have colours. So what we've got here is what we economists call an isoquant diagram. We measure the labour input on this axis here, the capital input on that axis there. And these lines, that blue line there, which we call the Frisch locus, that is an isoquant. It's a line which joins combinations of the two inputs that produce the same output. And what we know from our basic economics, what I know anyway, is that it's on that Frisch locus, combinations of the labour and capital input which lie on that Frisch locus minimise the long run average cost of the firm. So that's what we call technical efficiency. Right? To be efficient in a competitive setting where there's free entry, there's competition from other firms, the firm has to be at that point. That's where long run average costs are minimised. Up here in the northeast there, you've got decreasing returns to scale, so that's inefficient. But you've also got increasing returns to scale down here, so you haven't fully exhausted all the possibilities of returns to scale. So that firms down here are too small, firms up here are too big for efficiency. What we can show is that if there's internal financing and both the Vanek effect and the Furubot-Perovich effect are in force, then what we can easily show, and by the way, this is theory, but there's a lot of evidence to support it, we can show that the Vanek effect will induce the firm to adopt a capital labour ratio which is too low. So if you look at the slope of the blue line and the slope of the red block, the dotted lines there, the slope is the capital labour ratio. It's the capital divided by labour. So the Furubot-Perovich effect means that line will be too shallow. It'll be the red line rather than the blue line there. The Vanek effect means the firm will be too small. So too small means down to the left-hand corner, down here, the southwest corner of the diagram, where the firm is too small to exploit its economies of scale. Right? So if you put those two effects together, internal financing means the cooperative will be there, it'll be too small, and the capital labour ratio will be too low. Where it should go is up here, at the optimal scale, that's on the blue Frisch locus, where costs are average long-run costs are minimised, and the capital labour ratio is at the right level. Well, by right, I mean cost minimised. Okay, now I'm sorry about economics, but I am an economist, and this is about economics. So you don't really need to know exactly what the argument there is, the technical argument, but that's the argument that the Cornell guys are putting forward, right? And I should say, well, that's theory. Of course, it's theory. It's mathematical theory, and you can ignore the equations up here. They should simply say what I've just said in mathematical language. There is evidence to support this. There's evidence, empirical evidence, some of which was collected by me and other people, to show that internal financing does indeed lead to a capital labour ratio being too low and the scale being too small. Right? Now, and in fact, we also know that the most successful systems of cooperatives do have external financing institutions, right? And so we know Mondragon, for example, we've all heard of that, right? That's got an outside financing bank, has it not? Some kind of institution like that. The Danish cooperatives that I studied also have a financing fund, which is external to the firm. Okay? So I want to propose, going back to Philip Wyman's talk about the Swedish wage earner investment funds, another agency to be the outside source of finance for cooperatives. We'll come to that in a moment. So there's empirical evidence for these things as well as this theoretical idea. Right, okay, so that's the basic theory. And the point that the Cornell guys, such as Vanek, would make is that cooperatives are going to have this problem because they're going to be too small and they're going to have a capital labour ratio which is too low. So that means that if a conventional capitalist firm came along in the same industry, it could beat them out in competition, right? Because these guys, the costs are too high. They should be on their fresh locus here, and they're not. So the capitalist firm, now, there's a little twist to the argument here. The capitalist firm, in order to be forced, as I said, capitalists don't particularly like markets. They don't like competitive markets anyway. And actually, what our standard theory of markets says is it's competition that forces the capitalist firm onto that frisch locus, right? But if there's barriers to entry, if the firm could stop entry into the market, it might well become a monopoly. It might be up here, too big and too inefficient. Right? So let's compare our cooperative with its internal finance with a competitive capitalist firm with free entry and no barriers to entry and so on. So the point is that if the Vanek and Furbo and Perovich effects are really true, then a capitalist firm with competition could enter this market and undercut the cooperative because its costs would be lower. Its long-run average costs would be lower. Right? So that's their argument for why there aren't enough cooperatives around, or as many as we expect. They don't, in John Stuart Mill's words, predominate. There are some around, as I say, between 3 and 6% of GDP typically, but they don't predominate. Right? Because if you had a cooperative sector somewhere in the economy, it would be subject to competition from conventional firms, which would win out in competition. They'd enter the market, they'd undercut the cooperatives, and that would be the end of the story. Conversely, if you think of a market where the incumbents are capitalist firms, the cooperatives wouldn't really be able to get in because they wouldn't be able to get their costs low enough, in the long run at least, to beat out the capitalist firms in competition. So if you take those two arguments together, that's the Cornell explanation of why there are so few cooperatives around. That's their answer to the Pangloss theorem. Right. Now the thing is, how do capitalists do it? How do the capitalists do it? Well, under capitalism, institutions exist and have evolved over many years to arrange or to make arrangements for the external finance of the firm. So essentially, there are two ways that the capitalist firm can finance itself externally. We call them debt and equity. What we mean by debt is things like bonds. Right? You sell a bond with a fixed rate of return. A bond carries no control rights. So the lender has no right to manage the firm, no right to get inside the firm and take decisions or influence management decisions within the firm. So a bond carries a fixed rate of return and no control rights within the firm. So bond finance means that the risk, for example, of an investment project is borne by insiders, people within the firm. So if the firm carries out an investment project financed by bonds and that project goes horribly wrong, the bond still has to pay the rate of return. Right? So that risk is borne by the insiders in the firm. Under capitalism, they're its owners. Okay, so that's debt finance. The alternative is equity finance, that's to say the sale of shares. So a share is a title to a dividend, but that dividend is decided by the firm itself, right? So the bond carries a fixed rate of return. The share carries a dividend, but that dividend is decided by the firm itself. So the quid pro quo for taking that risk, I mean, if you are a shareholder, you could lose all your money, right? And you could lose all of it. And you certainly might end up earning a very low rate of return on your shares. That's decided by the firm itself. So you're taking the risk. And the quid pro quo for that is that you have some right to manage the firm. So in theory, the shareholders, who are the outside owners of the firm, have the right to appoint the management. They could, in principle, get together at the annual general meeting and sack the management if they don't like it, if they don't like what it's doing. Right? Or, less drastic than that, they could sell their shares on the secondary market, put pressure on the shareholders. So the quid pro quo for bearing that risk is that you have some right to manage the firm, or at least influence the firm's management. So, because bond finance imposes all the risk on the firm insiders, and equity finance puts it all onto the shoulders of the outside owners, a capitalist firm can select the optimal degree of risk bearing. It can allocate risk optimally. So, shareholders typically hold a portfolio of different shares, and they pool risks. And you don't own shares in the same industry or even the same country nowadays. Stock markets being global as they are. So the stock market allows risk pooling, and the balance between debt and equity finance means the capitalist firm can allocate risk optimally. Right? It doesn't have to bear all the risk itself. A self-managed firm, a cooperative, can't do that, right? Because the whole point, the whole deal under capitalism is if I lend you some money by buying your shares, I get some right to control your firm. A cooperative can't say that, right? Because the whole point of cooperative is that the right to manage rests with the workers in the firm and not with the outside owners. So that's the problem of internal finance. Now you might say, well, and a Panglossian would indeed say, see, these institutions have evolved over the years and they really work. Well actually, over the last, 5 or 6 years since the financial crash, a lot of people are saying, well, hang on a minute, they don't seem to work that well, do they? There are obviously problems with this mechanism, this time-honoured mechanism. And so lots of people are asking, is there an alternative? And so the interest, and I suppose you should be pleased about this as students of cooperation, there's a lot more interest in cooperatives these days. That also reflects another issue, which I'm coming to in just a moment, and that's inequality. Inequality has increased, at least inequality within countries, has increased dramatically over the last 20 years or so. So there's an issue there, and again, people are asking, actually this capitalist system of outside finance and outside control of the firm, the right to manage allocated to ownership, that system isn't working that well, is it? We've seen all kinds of problems with it recently. Right, okay, so now the Cornell guys, including Vanek and a guy called Roger McCain, proposed a solution to this problem. And that solution is to introduce a new financial instrument into the financial environment, if you like. And that financial instrument they called performance bonds. Some people call them participation bonds. And what they mean by a performance bond is a title to a dividend. So just remember, an ordinary bond gives you a fixed title to a rate of return. That's a fixed percentage of your investment. A share gives you a title to a dividend, but that's decided by the firm, not by you. A performance bond is a bond where the rate of return is linked by a definite formula, a definite hard and fast relationship, to some measure of the firm's performance. So it might be value added, for example. It might be income per worker. I mean, if you believe that the cooperative is trying to maximize income per worker, workers' income, if you believe that, then why not link the yield on your performance bond to income per worker? Then the firm, the insiders in the firm, their interests will be aligned with the interests of outside owners of performance bonds, right? The guys who own the performance bonds want that yield to be high, and the workers want their income to be high, presumably. Right? So that's what we call incentive compatibility. both the agents, the two classes of agent here, want the same thing. So that's what McCain and Vanek argued. They said, we'll introduce this new financial instrument called a performance bond into the financial environment, along with shares and ordinary bonds and other financial assets. What they showed, of course, obviously, these performance bonds would carry no right to interfere in the management of the firm, right? So they wouldn't be like shares in that respect. So you see, the incentive compatibility is guaranteed by the way the yield is defined, right? You don't need to give the outside owners the right to influence the firm's management because their interests are aligned anyway by the nature of the asset itself. So that's what they argued. And what they showed was, again, they showed this in theory, I have to admit, and we don't have, whereas much of what I've said so far, there is empirical evidence for, right? Unfortunately, we can't test this because, as far as I'm aware, and you may know differently, as far as I'm aware, there are no performance bonds actually existing. So there's a kind of Pangloss question there. If they were great, why haven't they been written or brought into existence in some way? Well, I think we could probably deal with that. Do we really believe that Pangloss argument? I mean, do you really think that investment banks are going to go to all the trouble of inventing some new financial instrument? Governments are going to regulate it and so on. Anyway, but that's an interesting argument. Why aren't there any performance bonds around? At least as far as I'm aware, there are not any. Anyway, okay, so they carry no power to influence the firm's management. But what McCain and Vanek showed was that if there's a financial environment including shares and bonds and performance bonds, the cooperative, operating autonomously without any control, without any interference by the government, will automatically choose the optimal degree of outside finance. So what it'll do is not issue a mixture of debt and equity, it'll issue a mixture of bonds and performance bonds. And by that mechanism, it'll automatically select the optimal financial structure. Now, McCain goes on to speculate on a possible extension of that argument. He says, I'm going to quote here, suppose that the performance bonds are bought by some social agency, such as a state or regional bank. The optimality of external finance with performance bonds means that the firm will willingly choose an efficient financial structure. I slightly modified it, the words in square brackets I put in myself, but the meaning's preserved, honestly. Okay, so McCain is suggesting then that these performance bonds could be held by some outside funding agency, such as the bank in the Mondragon system or the Cooperative Financing Fund in Denmark, for example. Right, okay, so happy so far. Now what I want to do, we've got about 10 minutes or so left, what I want to do is to suggest another institution, outside financing institution, which could hold these performance bonds, along with other financial assets such as shares and indeed ordinary bonds for that matter. And that institution is called a wage earners investment fund. And that's what Philip Wyman's paper, which I referred to at the beginning, is all about. In fact, he's particularly talking about the Swedish wage earner investment funds, and I'll come on to those in just a moment. So what we mean by a wage earner investment fund is a fund which receives income from a tax, possibly on wages or profits, and accumulates capital in the form of shares or bonds, or indeed performance bonds, and that's the key point, accumulates capital on behalf of workers. So such a fund would receive income from taxation, it would acquire capital in those various different forms I've mentioned, and it might return some of the, it's a savings vehicle for workers essentially, something like a pension fund. So it would return some of those savings to workers, possibly via the pension system, that's what happened in the Swedish case, or in the Danish proposal, which was never actually implemented, the system there was that workers could redeem their savings after some fixed period of time. I think it was 7 years. So whereas a pension fund, you only get the dosh when you retire, in the Danish setup, you could redeem your savings after a fixed period, which I think was 7 years. So there's lots of variations on this idea of a wage earners investment fund. But the way to think about it is a sort of super pension fund managed by workers. So the managers of the fund perhaps would be appointed by trade unions, as was the case in the Swedish proposal. Maybe the government might appoint some members of the management board. Maybe the manager would be directly elected in some way. There's all kinds of possible institutional arrangements you can imagine. And like so many things in economics, you can trace the idea back to Keynes. And in How to Pay for the War, published in 1940, I hope he quotes up there on the slide there, Keynes was interested in how to bring down consumption levels in the British economy to align the economy more with the needs of wartime production. So it's necessary to cut consumption to allow productive resources to be used to build, tanks and Spitfires and that kind of stuff. But he saw wider implications of his idea, and the quote up there says, this is from How to Pay for the War, the accumulation of working class wealth under working class control could induce an advance towards economic equality greater than any we have made in recent times. And given at the moment, as I said, there's a lot of interest in this idea of inequality increasing, you can see there's a possible reason why people might start getting interested in wage earner investment funds. Again, you all, I think, probably are familiar. You probably haven't read it, but at least you've heard of Thomas Piketty's famous book, right? Capital in the 21st Century. Anyone try to read it? No, very wise. It's absolutely enormous. I've read about a quarter of it, so that's quite heavy going. Anyway, it's a very interesting book. And of course, the whole thrust of that book is about inequality and how it essentially arises from capital accumulation. There's all kinds of reasons for inequality. People are, surgeons have got a lot of skill or human capital, so they command a higher salary, and so on and so forth. We can think of all kinds of little reasons, micro reasons. But Piketty's argument, and this is not just his, but it's advanced by lots of people, is that it's capital accumulation, and who owns assets and who doesn't own assets. That's the main reason for the increase in inequality we've seen over the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years. So that's the idea. We'll come on to, as I say, the Swedish wage earner funds in just a moment. But what happens at the moment to workers' savings? Right? So workers' savings, there have to be savings in the economy. There has to be capital accumulation to build up the capital stock for the future. But under capitalism, the institutional arrangements for workers' savings separate those savings from any mechanism of control over accumulation. Right? Workers' savings are managed by banks and pension funds and institutions such as that. And that has two effects. First of all, it reduces the rate of return. That's part of Piketty's argument about inequality. So you try and get a rate of interest in your savings nowadays, you won't get anything in the local banks and building societies and so on. Second effect is to separate workers' savings from worker control over accumulation. Right? The fact that you've saved something doesn't give you any right to take decisions about how capital is accumulated. That's under the present system. Right, now, so a wage earner investment fund is something like a sort of cooperative or worker-controlled pension fund, taking a long view in the stock market and taking investment decisions on behalf of working people. Now, does this ring a bell? Does this remind you of anything? Well, if you've studied business studies or you've seen those books, strange books you see in airports about how to succeed in business and all the rest of it, you've come across the name of Drucker, great business guru. But let's come on to Drucker in a moment. But just on this question of capital development of the country's savings and investment, Keynes, going back to the general theory, that's back to 1936 now, saw a general problem. Again, this should echo Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. He says in the general theory, when the capital development of a country becomes a byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done. That's from the general theory General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936. So that's consistent with his argument on how to pay for the war, right? And it should ring a bell. Just think back to the financial crisis of 5 or 6 years ago. Casino, investment activities, everything went wrong, right? So 1936, not much has changed in those intervening years. Okay, so going back to Drucker then, if you remember from those various management guru books you see in airports, Drucker's written hundreds of these, but he wrote a book, I think in 1976, called The Unseen Revolution, How Pension Fund Socialism Came to America. And he actually seemed to think, now I think he was joking actually, let's be honest, but he seemed to suggest that pension funds actually could be a solution to this problem of separating, of problems with the capital development of countries, the dichotomy between savings and investment. So he actually argued that the United States, with its extensive system of pension funds, was the first truly socialist country in the world. Because, in theory, in some theoretical sense, pensioners, who are mostly workers, own their pension funds and therefore own the capital stock. What is socialism, on his view? At least it's about the ownership of capital. Now that's just a silly argument, right? So I say, the institutions, the existing institutions, which manage savings, don't, first of all, they reduce the rate of return to a very low, sometimes even negative level, and also they separate those savings from control over the capital accumulation they lead to. So, I don't think the United States was the first truly socialist country in the world. I think Drucker might have been joking there. But that doesn't mean to say that that's the right order. That doesn't mean to say that the argument is entirely wrong, and that brings us to the Swedish wage earner investment fund. Okay. So I guess there are no Scandinavians in, I hope, because I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the, I think that's meant to be Swedish there, Löntagarfonder. There should be an umlaut over the first O, I think. Maybe a line through it or something like that. Anyway, so I'm just going to call them wage earner investment funds, and as I say, that's what's discussed in the Philip Wyman paper I referred to at the beginning. So these wage earner investment funds then were a development of what is called the Meidner Plan, and you may have heard of that. That was a plan developed by Rudolf Meidner in the 50s and 60s about how to combine sort of Keynesian policies with a degree of worker control and influence in the economy. In fact, the wage earner investment funds, which were actually set up, there were 5 of them, established in 1984 and wound up in 1991. They actually didn't exactly correspond to Meidner's original idea. In fact, in some senses were more radical in that the actual wage earner funds set up had a much more active investment policy. And I want to come on to argue how that might be modified at the end of the talk here. So the idea then was that these wage earner investment funds had received income from a mixture of a profits tax and a payroll tax. They'd accumulate capital on behalf of workers. They'd be managed by trade union representatives. Their opponents referred to them as trade union funds, implying that this would lead to disaster and East European style socialism or communism introduced via the back door, as it were. I've got a couple of quotations in a moment to illustrate that. Under the Swedish arrangements, the idea was to pay the redemptions of savings into the pension fund, to strengthen the pension fund system. Other alternative proposals have been advanced in other European countries, including the United Kingdom, where there's a green paper, which I couldn't find when I looked for it this morning, written by somebody called Neil Kinnock. Remember him? He used to be a politician. Anyway, which proposes a wage earner investment fund for the United Kingdom. As you know, that obviously died the death, didn't go anywhere. Proposals in Germany and Netherlands and the other Scandinavian countries were all discussed much more extensively. And an interesting political point here, and you can see this from Germany,